Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
Until now, you probably thought that they were dead. That's what we've been led to believe for so many years. The scientific community has never fully laid to rest the matter of whether these deadly and destructive creations are truly alive or dead. But now, they're coming to life, and they're everywhere. There's no way to avoid being infected by one of them. It's just a matter of when.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I am, of course, referring to viruses. I was inspired to make this by a rather interesting paper from 2008 that I came across recently. I'll put a link in the description, but alas it's not free to access without a subscription to Nature, so I'll share the general message here. The paper proposes to define viruses and other organisms based on the content of their genomes, since many of the older definitions have now been overturned. For instance, at one time viruses were categorized by their size. They were invisible under a light microscope and could pass through 200 nanometer filters. Then came along mimivirus, a virus which was larger than some cellular life forms, and was most certainly visible under a light microscope. The same overlap can be seen in genome size, so there's no room for a division there. It was then suggested that maybe the distinction could be made that, in viruses, the genetic material was the infectious agent, while in cellular organisms it was the cell itself. But that idea was overturned following the first successful genome transplant. It proved that the genome was the only essential requirement to define an infectious organism. Also, an attempt was made in the 1950s to classify viruses as molecular genetic parasites that use cellular systems for their replication. When it was discovered that certain genetic elements within cellular organisms fitted this role, such as plasmids and transposons, a rethink was needed. The result of all this is that the distinction between viruses and cells becomes very blurry, and with that comes the added baggage of what can be considered life. Many of you will remember learning in schools the 7 processes that constitute life: movement, reproduction, sensitivity, nutrition, excretion, respiration, and growth, or Mrs. Nerg for short. The trouble here is that some organisms which are definitely living don't fit all the categories. A mule which is sterile can't reproduce, so does that mean it's dead? If we're distinguishing movement from growth, then a lot of plants fail that criterion. Some plants definitely move, but others, especially some algae, have no capacity to move at all. The same goes for fungi and most bacteria. Chloroplasts, on the other hand, can move after a fashion, and thus tick all the boxes except for respiration. Where does that leave them? Viruses, meanwhile, can reproduce, need nutritional resources to form, and are said to grow. Clearly the Mrs. Nerg system doesn't cover it. Perhaps we should ditch all that and see what constitutes an organism. Wikipedia's definition, and that from the Oxford English Dictionary, do exclude viruses by referring to cellular organisms. But Chambers' reference online doesn't stipulate this, and includes viruses and nucleic acids. The fact that each organism is determined by its genetic content suggests that the definition should lie there, and this is where the paper makes its case. But can we therefore have living organisms and dead organisms? As for the very definition of life, there is no consensus. The paper cites Wikipedia of all places, mainly because it's the most widely available encyclopedia on Earth. One of their definitions, a condition that distinguishes organisms from inorganic objects, doesn't really get us anywhere. But this one, life is a characteristic of self-organizing, self-recycling systems consisting of populations of replicators that are capable of mutation around which homeostatic, metabolizing organisms evolve, most clearly allows for viruses to be included. So what do I think? I personally embrace the inclusion of viruses as living organisms. Any organic self-replicating entity is, in my books, alive, and it seems unjust to try and belittle the dramatic impact that viruses can have on their target hosts. So what difference does it make? Well, not much, but one thing that it does mean is that I can no longer get angry when cleaning product commercials claim to kill the flu virus. It also means that humans have actually succeeded in creating a synthetic life form from scratch way back in 2002. Maybe scientists have already started playing God.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
And just remember, it won't be long before once again your body is taken over from inside by millions of microscopic life forms. Sweet dreams, and a happy Halloween. In researching this video, I came across what has to be the greatest thing I have ever read in the scientific literature, and I think it's worth a mention here so you can look it up. This was written in 1957 by André Loff on the subject of characterizing viruses. It contains some rather richly dark language in places, and one of the most unusual illustrations ever for a scientific paper. I'd like to share them with you now.
And when the idea was proposed that viruses were perhaps not microbes, but might have originated from some pathological constituents of their host cell, then the theory of spontaneous generation seemed to revive from its ashes. The supporters of the endogenous theory were accused of heresy, and a smell of sulfur was floating in the air. The inquisitors of faith have tried, and are still trying, to ridicule the endogenous theory by brandishing the threadbare scarecrow of heterogenesis. The endogenous theory of the origin of viruses is a theory. It may be wrong, but it is not absurd. If discussed at all, it should be discussed scientifically. Those who claim to possess the truth should remember that heterogenesis was once the truth, and the spectre of heterogenesis should be allowed to rest in the famed purple sheet where scientists shroud their dead gods. When one walks in the country, one sees cows, sheep, hogs, horses, men. One sees individual mammals.
One never sees a mammal in general, because such a thing does not exist.
The mammal in general could be a dream, but it is a concept.
They don't write them like that anymore.